Would it be fair to say that Mr. Epstein trafficked young women, including, in some instances, minors, for sex to himself?
That was specifically the allegations in the 2018 indictment in the Southern District of New York.
You see that right there? In the most powerful rooms in Washington, sometimes the loudest sound isn't a gavel or a shout. It's the silence, or a wall of legalese carefully constructed to bury a very simple truth. We don't just listen to what they want us to hear. When a witness starts dancing around a simple yes or no question, that's exactly where the real story begins. So, why did they choose those specific words, and what legal maneuver is hiding behind that hesitation? Let's strip away the political theater, decode the strategy, and look at the raw reality of what actually just happened. This hearing didn't begin with a question. It began like watching a pilot insist everything is fine while the warning lights are already screaming in red. Except this time, the passengers are the public, and the cockpit controls are the law itself. So here's the question that cut through the room like a blade. When the facts are documented, the timeline is fixed, and the rules are written in plain English. Why does the answer still refuse to land? This is not a normal hearing. This is a controlled collision between documented reality and carefully constructed denial, unfolding in real time, with every second tightening the gap between what was said and what cannot be defended. And from the very first exchange, the tone is set, not by what is admitted, but by what is carefully avoided. The moment the central question is placed on the table, it does not arrive as speculation. It arrives with structure, with dates, with prior statements already on record. And yet, the response that follows doesn't engage that structure. It circles it, it reframes it, it delays it. That is not confusion. That is strategy. Listen closely to the wording. The answer doesn't deny the core fact outright. It shifts language, narrows scope, leans on ambiguity, and that creates the first fracture. Because when a direct question meets an indirect answer, what you are witnessing is not dialogue. It is evasion under pressure. Now move into prosecutorial mode. The timeline matters. Statements made previously are not rumors. They are recorded positions. Actions taken are not interpretations. They are documented events. When those two collide, when what was said before no longer aligns with what is being said now, that is not a misunderstanding. That is a contradiction with consequences. And here is where the weight shifts, because this is no longer about one official, one answer, or one hearing clip. This is about whether the system itself can tolerate answers that bend without breaking, statements that shift without accountability. Because the people outside that room don't have the luxury of redefining facts when they are inconvenient. They live with outcomes, not explanations. So the real question becomes sharper, heavier, harder to ignore. If the rules are clear, and the record is public, and the contradiction is visible to anyone paying attention, then what exactly is still being protected here? And the deeper you go, the harder it becomes to pretend this is just a misunderstanding, because now the questioning tightens, the language sharpens, the room shifts from polite exchange into controlled pressure. The same question returns, slightly reworded, more precise, stripped of any escape routes, and this time the gap between the question and the answer doesn't just exist, it widens. What you start to notice is not hesitation, but pattern. Answers begin with qualifiers. They lean on process instead of substance. They redirect toward general principles instead of addressing specific actions. That is not accidental. That is how you build distance between yourself and a fact you cannot comfortably confirm or deny. And then comes the pivot point. A prior statement is introduced, not hypothetically, not loosely, but as a fixed record. A quote, a position, something said clearly, publicly, and without ambiguity. And now, placed next to the current answer, it doesn't align, not partially, not interpretively. It simply does not match. This is where the hearing stops being procedural and starts becoming evidentiary. Because once two statements from the same individual cannot coexist without conflict, the burden is no longer on the questioner to clarify. It shifts entirely to the person answering to reconcile the contradiction. And instead of reconciliation, what follows is narrowing. Words get smaller. Scope gets tighter. Definitions become selective. That's not what I meant. That's not how I would characterize it. That's outside the context. Each phrase sounds reasonable on its own, but stacked together, they don't resolve the conflict. They dilute it. Now step back and look at what that means. If a statement only holds under specific wording, in a limited context, with carefully controlled definitions, then it doesn't hold as truth. It holds as positioning. And positioning is not what this room is supposed to be built on. Because outside this room, reality doesn't adjust itself to phrasing. Actions carry consequences, whether they are framed broadly or narrowly. The people affected by those actions don't experience them as context-dependent. They experience outcomes. Directly. Permanently. So, when the answer avoids the center of the question, when the record contradicts the current stance, and when the response relies more on language than on fact, the issue is no longer what happened. The issue is whether the system will accept an answer that technically exists, but functionally explains nothing. At this point, the hearing doesn't feel like a conversation anymore. It feels like watching someone walk a tightrope stretched over their own prior statements. Every step measured, every word chosen. Knowing that one misalignment isn't just a stumble, it's exposure. And that leads to the question that now defines everything. If the truth is stable, why does every answer need to be balanced so carefully to avoid it? Now the structure tightens even further. The question is no longer open-ended. It is binary. Yes or no. Did it happen, or did it not? Was the decision made, or was it not? And this is where the entire strategy begins to strain, because binary questions do not allow room for interpretation. They force alignment with reality. But instead of a clean answer, what emerges is something else entirely. Time is used as a buffer. Words are used as padding. The response stretches, expands, reframes. Anything to avoid collapsing into a single accountable position. And that delay, that elongation, becomes its own signal. Because when clarity is available but not delivered, it is not a limitation. It is a choice. Now layer in the record again. Prior testimony. Public statements. Documented actions tied to specific outcomes. When these are placed against the current response, the tension is no longer subtle. It becomes visible even to someone hearing it for the first time. The alignment is missing. And where alignment should exist, there is friction. This is the moment where the hearing crosses into moral territory. Because this is no longer about whether someone misspoke or whether context was misunderstood. It is about whether a person in a position of authority is willing to say the same thing under scrutiny that they said when there was none. And outside that room, this distinction matters more than anything else. Because people do not experience policy as language. They experience it as consequence. Jobs affected, rights altered, trust either reinforced or broken. And when the explanation given under oath cannot cleanly match the actions already taken, the damage is not theoretical. It is lived. So the pressure now is not just coming from the questioner. It is coming from the weight of expectation. That when facts are fixed, answers should be too. And when they are not, when they shift, narrow, or dissolve under scrutiny, the issue is no longer what happened. The issue is whether the truth is being managed instead of revealed. Now everything converges, not gradually, not subtly, but all at once, like a door finally forced open after being pushed from every angle. Because by this point, the hearing is no longer about extracting new information. It is about exposing what the existing information already proves when placed side by side without protection. The timeline has been locked. The statements have been read. The answers have been given, or more precisely, shaped. And when you lay them out in sequence, something becomes impossible to ignore. The consistency is gone, but the intent to appear consistent remains. That gap is where credibility collapses. This is the final prosecutorial moment. Not louder, not more aggressive, just clearer. The kind of clarity that doesn't need emphasis because the structure itself does the work. If statement A was made publicly, and action B followed in contradiction to that statement, and answer C now attempts to reconcile both without fully acknowledging either, then the issue is not confusion. It is construction. And construction, when applied to truth, is a form of control. Control over perception. Control over accountability. Control over how much the public is allowed to actually understand versus what they are expected to accept. But control has limits, and this is where those limits become visible. Because outside the chamber, there are no procedural buffers, no softened language, no opportunity to reframe after the fact. There are only consequences that have already happened. People who have already been affected. Decisions that cannot be undone simply because the explanation doesn't hold under pressure. This is the moral breaking point. Not because of what was said in one answer, but because of the pattern across all of them. A pattern where clarity was available but avoided, where alignment was possible but rejected, where truth was within reach but never fully delivered. And when that pattern repeats, it stops being accidental. So, what does this actually mean? It means this was never just about a hearing. It was a test of whether the system still demands coherence between words and actions, or whether it has grown comfortable allowing them to drift apart as long as the presentation remains controlled. And that brings us to the only question that matters now. If the record is clear, the contradictions are visible, and the answers still refuse to fully connect, then who, exactly, is being served by that silence? If you've watched this far, you already know the stakes, so don't scroll past it. Don't ignore it. Like, comment, share, and subscribe, because the only thing more dangerous than unanswered questions is a public that stops